This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lo Kui. So tonight's top stories. China's premier in Russia for an annual meeting with his counterpart amid a broader push to further beef up already robust ties. Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomes a Fijian plan that aims to avoid engagement with all major powers and militarization of the Pacific Islands region. China expresses concern over reports pointing to U.S. approval of a strategic plan that focuses on the mainland's rapid expansion of its atomic arsenal. Authorities in Beijing take aim at dairy imports from the European Union, launching an anti-subsidy probe a day after the bloc announced revised taxes for Chinese-made electric vehicles. And also head on East Asia tonight. A notable omission from Kamala Harris's foreign policy plans, with a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula missing from the text, as in sharp contrast to Joe Biden's 2020 platform. How the November election will affect how the U.S. is handling North Korea. We have an expert weigh in on that issue. Chinese Premier Li Qiang is in Moscow to hold talks aimed at deepening cooperation. He earlier met Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. According to Russian news agency TASS, the pair were likely to have discussed comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction in various sectors, including trade. Mr. Li is expected to meet President Vladimir Putin for talks at the Kremlin later in the day before heading to Belarus on Friday. This year marks the 75th anniversary of Sino-Russian diplomatic ties. Leaders from both sides have held annual talks since 1996. The Chinese diplomat's visit is the first since a surprise military incursion by Ukrainian forces into the Russian border region of Kursk 2 weeks ago. And for more, Dasha Chernysheва joins us live from Moscow. Dasha, China and Russia, we've seen them drawing ever closer together, touting close cooperation at a time when others have grown increasingly wary of this relationship. What are leaders, this time Li Qiang, in Moscow, hoping to signify with this meeting?
Well, indeed, another important meeting in the bilateral ties between Russia and China. We understand that the sides are expected to deepen their economic cooperation at a time that is of particular importance, especially given the statements on the establishment of the new world order, as well as the diversification of Russia's economic ties with the countries. We understand that the prime focus was indeed on deepening this economic cooperation. The sides have signed the plan on the mutual investments. Mikhail Mishustin, the Prime Minister of Russia, has also said that the two countries have to deepen cooperation in the economic sphere and to beef up the use of different logistics channels. For this, he said, there is the opportunity to use to the full extent the capacities of Russia's northern sea route. So we understand that the sides are also expected to deepen cooperation in the technology, sharing their know-hows in the area of artificial intelligence, but also keep in mind that this is an important visit in terms of politics. The Prime Minister of Moscow, of Russia, has said that the link between the cooperation between Russia and China is important in terms of stabilizing the international relations at these difficult and turbulent times. He also has said it is beneficial for the peoples of these two countries, but also it is taking place after the Western comments suggesting that China is the key enabler of Russia's operation in Ukraine. So this visit is also seen as a jab to the West, but also keep in mind China has taken a neutral stance in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, urging the sides actually to find a negotiated solution.
Dasha, China may have an official position on neutrality as regard that war in Ukraine, but the very fact that trade ties remain so strong between China and Russia suggests that there is some support at least from Beijing on some angles, that may indirectly support that war in Ukraine. Given what we've seen, the surprise incursion into the Russian border region of Kursk, is this visit likely to have any impact in terms of Chinese support for Russia?
Well, from the position of Russian officials who have insisted that Russia does not need anybody's direct support for its military effort in Ukraine, it is not expected that China will be helping with any sort of supplies, because Moscow has been insisting it is able to conduct its operations on its own. And we are now seeing Russian military creating 3 new groupings of troops in the border areas between Russia and Ukraine. Those are the formations that are now tasked with defending the 3 regions of Belgorod, Kursk and Bryansk against the Ukrainian military. So in terms of that, we understand there is no support. However, indeed, the very fact that these 2 countries are working closely in the interests of their economies is definitely quite worrying for the Western countries. With regard to that, we are quite unlikely to see any sort of official outcomes, but also keep in mind that Russia is not retreating on other fronts in Ukraine. The Russian officials have confirmed that while this incursion into Russia's Kursk region has been ongoing, the Russian troops have not been pulled out from the front lines in Donbass, and the officials here insist that they have actually made some gains, especially in the Donetsk direction, where several settlements, key settlements for the front lines, have been coming under the Russian control.
And thanks, Dasha Chernyshyova reporting live to us there from Moscow. Chinese President Xi Jinping has given his support to Fijian Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka on his Ocean of Peace foreign policy vision for Pacific Island nations. The concept envisions engagement with all major powers and stresses the avoidance of militarization in the island region. Beijing's backing of the Pacific Plan comes as Fiji is set to raise the concept at an upcoming summit for Pacific Island leaders in Tonga. Mr. Xi said in a handout that China appreciates the Fijian leader's vision and is committed to working with him to contribute to international peace and security. Mr. Rabuka said he felt encouraged by China's ideas on peaceful coexistence and progress, and noted that they were in line with his Ocean of Peace vision. The remarks come as the Fijian leader concludes his 10-day tour of China. Mr. Rabuka earlier mentioned he did not want to, quote, upset the apple cart on regional security in the Pacific. China and the U.S. have been competing for influence in the region due to its strategic location for both trade and security. China says it's seriously concerned about a report suggesting the U.S. has approved a nuclear strategic plan to focus on Beijing's rapid expansion of its atomic arsenal. Beijing says the U.S. is peddling the China nuclear threat narrative and finding excuses to seek strategic advantage. The White House has since refuted the New York Times report, saying the updated plan is not a response to any single country or threat. The U.S.-based Arms Control Association says America's nuclear weapons strategy remains the same and has not moved away from Russia and toward China. U.S. intelligence estimates suggest that China may increase its nuclear arsenal from 500 to 1,000 warheads by the year 2030. But Russia already has some 4,000 nuclear warheads and remains the major driver behind U.S. nuclear strategy. The Times also reporting that the U.S. forces have been ordered for the first time to prepare for possible coordinated nuclear confrontations with Russia, China, and North Korea. Moscow has drawn closer to Beijing and Pyongyang amid increasing isolation over its invasion of Ukraine. According to the Times, U.S. officials say it's only a matter of time before a fundamentally different nuclear environment changes American war plans as well as its strategy. Just last month, China suspended talks on nuclear arms control with the U.S. to protest Washington's arms sales to Taiwan. China slammed a remark made by Taiwan's president, who warned other nations of what he calls Beijing's growing authoritarianism. A foreign ministry spokesperson repeated Beijing's stance that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. Mao Ning accused Taiwanese authorities of engaging in secession and said no external forces will be allowed to interfere. Taiwan's President William Lai was speaking at an annual forum on Indo-Pacific security in Taipei. He said China's military aggression has become worse, warning that it would not stop at Taiwan.
We have also seen China's military expansionism in the East and South China Seas, not only through military exercise in the Taiwan Straits, but also in joint sea and air drills with Russia in the South China Sea, Western Pacific, and Sea of Japan. Such actions are intended to intimidate China's neighbors and undermine regional peace and stability.
Mr. Lai encouraged politicians at the forum to work with Taiwan to counter Chinese influence in the region. He stressed that Taiwan will not be intimidated and that the island will take responsibility to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Beijing has been ramping up military and political pressure, with Taiwan reporting near-daily sightings of Chinese warships around its waters. Yesterday, a senior Chinese Communist Party official said Beijing is confident of an eventual, quote, complete reunification. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. says his government is investigating how a former town mayor wanted for alleged ties with Chinese criminal syndicates managed to flee the country. Alice Guo is wanted by the Senate on an arrest warrant. Mr. Marcos has warned that anyone who aided the ex-Bamban mayor in her escape will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. The remarks come a day after the president ordered authorities to cancel Ms. Guo's Philippine passport. Authorities in the Philippines say they have received immigration records from other countries that show that Ms. Guo traveled to Malaysia and Singapore last month. She reportedly went to Batam on the 18th of August using her Philippine passport. Authorities say it's unclear when she left the Philippines. But Ms. Guo's lawyer insists that she is still in the country without providing any further details. Ms. Guo refused to attend hearings on her alleged criminal ties, insisting she is a natural-born Philippine citizen facing what she called malicious accusations. She's the subject of a Senate investigation after authorities uncovered what they said were scams perpetrated from a facility built on land partially owned by the former mayor back in March. The raid shed light on criminal activity in the mostly Chinese-backed online casino industry. Her case also comes at a time of growing Philippine suspicion about China's activities following heightened tensions in the South China Sea. And in China, 7 workers at a coal mine have died in an accident after they were trapped while sealing off a ventilation shaft. Rescue crew are reportedly searching for an 8th worker. The incident happened this morning at Leshan City in the mountainous Sichuan municipality. The cause is unclear and province. The cause is unclear and investigations are ongoing. This comes days after tragedy struck another coal mine at Zhaotong City in neighboring Yunnan province. That incident involving a gas outburst killed 4 workers. 2 others remain missing. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, Chinese EV maker XPeng gives a downbeat sales forecast after its latest revenue misses consensus. Japanese exports rising for the 8th straight month, adding to optimism that Asia's number 2 economy can sustain a recovery. And welcome back to East Asia tonight. It's time for business news with Roland Lim. Roland, China upping the ante against the European Union.
Indeed, Wei Su, those trade tensions are looking to heat up. Beijing will kick off an anti-subsidy probe into EU dairy imports from today. And that's a day after the EU bloc outlined plans to impose 5-year import duties of up to 36% on Chinese electric vehicles. Now, Beijing's investigation appears to be targeted mainly at Ireland, which is the biggest exporter of dairy products to China. It shipped $461 million worth of such goods to China last year. The probe will focus on various types of cheeses, milks, and creams intended for human consumption. Now, prompted by a complaint from China's dairy industry bodies, the country will examine 20 schemes from the EU bloc. And these include those from Austria, Belgium, Croatia, Czech Republic, Finland, Ireland, Italy, and Romania. Now, yesterday, the EU revised the tariffs it'll levy on Chinese-made EV imports following its draft findings on anti-subsidy probes. Now, it trimmed those taxes by about half to 1 percentage points for Chinese EV makers from the levels it penciled back in July. And that compares with a drastic halving of the duties for Tesla's China-made vehicles to 9% tax from the original of almost 21%. Now, these are on top of the current 10% tax the EU charges on car imports. China's SAIC Motor, which has to pay the highest extra tax of 36.3%, says today it'll take further legal measures to protect its rights and interests. China's biggest car maker adds that its overall sales this year have encountered short-term fluctuations due to pressure from the EU as well as the US. It earlier announced total sales in the first 7 months of this year slipping 16% to about 2.1 million units. Quick check on how the Chinese EV makers fared in the stock markets today. Well, SAIC, the worst performer, shedding about 0.3%. Its peer, Geely, was underwater for most of the day but managed to eke out some gains to end nearly flat. BYD managed to pull back from a weak open, closing both higher in Shenzhen and in Hong Kong. Chinese EV maker XPeng's latest sales forecast coming below expectations. That's after its June quarter revenue missed estimates. Now, it sees third quarter revenue hitting as much as $1.37 billion, and that compares with analyst consensus of $1.46 billion. The firm is hurt by stiff competition and a drop in demand for its aging lineup of pricier electric vehicles. It is planning to refresh its model lineup by launching a new range of new EVs in the next 3 years. But its expansion plans have been temporarily throttled by the EU's move to impose tariffs on China-made EVs. It is among the Chinese companies considering setting up a manufacturing plant in the region to avoid those tariffs. Its Hong Kong listed shares ended about 2.2% lower today. Despite the headwinds facing Chinese EV makers in other markets, BYD is upbeat about its prospects in Singapore. Now, it's set to launch its premium sub-brand, Danza, in the city-state on the 10th of October. And this marks the second destination out of mainland China where Danza vehicles will be sold. And moving forward, the automaker tells CNA it plans to roll out a new car model in the city-state every year. The first Danza model to be sold in Singapore will be the D9. That's a fully electric luxury 7-seater MPV. Its selling price has yet to be revealed. Now, the model has been available in mainland China since 2022 and was launched in June in Hong Kong and Macau. The automaker marked the production of its first batch of multi-purpose vehicles, or MPVs, for the non-mainland market at its factory in central China's Changsha city today.
在 MPV 的这个领域里边呢，我们现在出海车型其实还没有啊，因此的话呢，应该是在最好的时候。其实新加坡对比亚迪来讲，一直是非常在比亚迪新能源汽车海外拓展过程当中最重要的市场之一。因为10年前我们就去了新加坡，我们为新加坡做的这种提案，不是单纯的一个车型，也不是单纯的一个车辆，而是结合新加坡市场整体的发展前景，以及政府对绿色经济的一个展望。
Danza was started as a 50-50 collaboration with German automaker Mercedes-Benz back in 2010. It was relaunched in 2022, with BYD taking 90% of the share, while positioning its products for the premium market. Now, South Korea's Kia and parent Hyundai have outperformed in the US EV market, with their combined market share ranking second in the first 7 months of this year. According to an industry report, the South Korean automaking giants overtook US manufacturers like Ford and General Motors. Now, Tesla took the lead, commanding nearly half of the US's EV market. Its followed by Hyundai and Kia with a combined share of 10%. Ranking third is Ford at 7.4%, General Motors with 6.3%. Now, Hyundai's performance in the US was attributed to its flagship electronic vehicles, that's the Ioniq 5 and Ioniq 6. Now, last month, sales of the 5 and 6 rose 25% and 54% respectively on year. Now, Kia's EV9 SUV or sports utility vehicle also outperformed competitors like Toyota, Volkswagen and Tesla in the first half of the year. Japan's exports grew for an 8th straight month in July, helped by a weak yen and a pickup in the auto sector. And that supports the view that the economy can sustain a recovery in the second half of the year after growth contracted earlier. Exports rose about 10% on year in July. They fell short of expectations, but came in higher than the 5.4% growth in June. Imports increased nearly 17% on year last month. Japan is pinning its hopes on exports to fire up growth as it mounts a recovery in the second half. The country was able to reverse a first quarter downturn, recording an annualized growth of 3.1% in the 3 months ended June. This was driven by a strong pickup in consumption. Still, economists sound a note of caution over the differing strength of internal and external demand. Meanwhile, South Korea's early trade data shows that export momentum continues to grow. Now, exports for the first 20 days this month increased 18.5% amid surging demand for semiconductors. The data from South Korea is seen as a bellwether for global trade because its exports make their way to a wide variety of products. East Asian markets ending the day lower, decline tracking a pause in Wall Street's rally as investors wait for U.S. payrolls data as well as Fed minutes for clues on interest rate cuts. Greater China markets under pressure, particularly the tech counters. Now, JD.com, a big decline in Hong Kong, following reports its biggest shareholder, Walmart, had sold its entire stake worth around $4 billion. Now, the e-commerce giant tanking nearly 9%, the Hang Seng Index losing about 0.8%. Meantime, the CSI 300, which measures the biggest firms listed on the mainland, shedding about 0.33% at the close. Turning to Japan, consumers could get some relief from high import prices as the yen continues to emerge from a prolonged slump. The Japanese currency now at around, 146.14 to the dollar, and it's off the back of its recent rally. Meantime, the Nikkei 225 also declining 0.29% for the day. Investors on edge ahead of back-to-back speeches by Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda, as well as Fed Chair Jerome Powell at Jackson Hole later this week. In Seoul, the Kospi ended up 0.17, following signs of a pickup in inflation after fresh data showed a rise in producer prices for the month of July. Hong Kong's bourse operator reporting its first profit growth in 3 quarters. Rising IPO and trading activity leading it to log revenue records and income for the April to June period. Now, Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing reported pre-tax profit of $4 billion for the second quarter. That's up 8% on year. Revenues of $5.4 billion also up 7%. But for its first half, the operator of Hong Kong's stock exchange reported a 3% decline in profits. Now, HKX's new chief says that Hong Kong's securities market has experienced a notable uplift in trading volumes since March. And that's all the business news. It's back to you, Wei Su.
And thanks for that, Roland. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, North Korea is high on America's watch list when it comes to its nuclear weapons program. For years of pushing Pyongyang to denuclearize, those have not gone anywhere. Only Pyongyang doubling down on its intention to keep its weapons intact. Should the US try a new approach? We'll be asking an expert that very question in just a moment on this issue. You're watching East Asia Tonight. China's premier in Russia for an annual meeting with his counterpart amid a broader push to further beef up already robust ties. Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomes a Fijian plan that aims to engage with all major powers and avoid the militarization of the Pacific Islands region. And authorities in Beijing take aim at dairy imports from the EU, launching an anti-subsidy probe a day after the bloc announced revised taxes for Chinese-made electric vehicles. On day 2 of the U.S. Democratic National Convention, and former U.S. President Barack Obama has thrown his weight behind the party's nominee, that's Kamala Harris. The closely watched race for the White House is entering its final months before the polls in November. Countries are scrambling to prepare for either a Harris administration that will likely build on Joe Biden's network of alliances to confront shared challenges, including North Korea, or a policy shift under a second Donald Trump term with his America First creed. The Pentagon has sought to allay its East Asian partners' fears, saying on Tuesday the United States alliance with South Korea and Japan will continue to get even stronger, regardless of who should win the top job. With the omission of a long-standing goal of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula from Ms. Harris's platform, revealed on Sunday, raising eyebrows in Seoul. And for more, we speak with Meredith Shaw. She is a political scientist who is a Korea Foundation Fellow and a visiting scholar at the Korea Institute for National Unification. And she joins us from Seoul. Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Now, eyebrows raised because, yes, the exclusion of the word complete denuclearization from Ms. Harris's foreign policy platform. We neglect to mention that that same exclusion took place on the platform for the Republican pair, that's Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. So we have a bipartisan agreement not to explicitly mention denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula as part of foreign policy plans for that part of East Asia. How significant is that?
Well, it's made quite a splash here in South Korea, that's for sure. It seems like perhaps the Republican platform went more unnoticed because the Republican platform took off all mentions of Korean issues. So it wasn't as surprising or noticeable that they eliminated this word denuclearization. But the Harris platform that just came out, it talks about North Korea, talks about deterrence, but it took away that key phrase. And at a time when the alliance is going through some unease in South Korea, that created a big stir. So it seems as if they're walking that back, and it will be interesting to see what sort of assurances they can provide to the South Korean partners going forward.
I suppose in an occasion like a presidential election, platforms become very much something that people do notice. But if we look back, certainly the Biden policy review on North Korea in 2021, since then, the types of phrases that have been associated with policy on North Korea. So you've got interim steps, confidence building, risk reduction, threat reduction, conflict avoidance. These are one way of steering clear of explicit, complete, I suppose, commitment to complete, full, unqualified denuclearization. If this is in fact true, this has been in motion certainly for months, if not years, the moving back from complete denuclearization.
Right. I think it probably reflects a sense of reality that North Korea does have some nuclear armament, and the previous policy of predicating all talks on the principle that denuclearization has to be the goal has significantly set back diplomacy in basic efforts to build a confidence sharing relationship with North Korea. So there perhaps is a reflection that we need a new approach, if for no other reason than to get the two sides talking again, thinking towards safeguards, nuclear safeguards for what the North Korean program is currently building. it's not good for them to be in complete isolation building a dangerous program like this. However, completely removing the word denuclearization does have repercussions for the non-proliferation regime globally, long-term, as well as I mentioned, making South Korea feel uneasy and uncertain of its position. So it's going to be a difficult linguistic path to walk for the US authorities.
Well, South Korea and Japan certainly within close proximity to North Korea and therefore immediate targets should there be a short-range ballistic missile firing from North Korea. How are they getting the reassurance they need from Washington, apart from trilateral meetings, promises, drills? Is there real reassurance that the US can give to these allies that should anything happen, the US will back them up?
Well, right. More trilateral drills, more meetings, and more upfront positioning of the North Korean issue on the US foreign policy platform would be a start. There are some voices in South Korea and have been building for some time saying that South Korea needs its own nuclear armament, and in a way that would put the pressure off of the US because South Korea would then have its own ability to deter North Korea without the US making extending this nuclear umbrella that's somewhat perhaps unreliable in the future. That those voices will be getting louder if the conversation continues in this direction of taking denuclearization off the table.
But I take that this view of South Korea developing its very own nuclear program, nuclear weapons program, is not a mainstream view. Recently, we had the defense minister coming out to say that should this actually happen, it would fracture relations with key ally, the United States, is one thing. It would also deal a catastrophic economic blow to South Korea's finances. So this is not mainstream. Where are we actually within South Korea? How accepted is this idea that we cannot look elsewhere? We need to look after ourselves.
Right. So it very much depends on how you phrase the question in South Korea. There have been some polls showing that a majority of South Koreans, in fact, as much as 70%, believe that South Korea should have its own nuclear armament. But when you start talking about what that would mean in terms of withdrawing from the NPT, being subject to international sanctions, possibly fracturing the relationships with Japan and the United States, obviously those put it into a different perspective. But in the abstract, a majority of South Koreans would like to see some kind of their ownership of a nuclear deterrent. So I think the most practical way of talking about this right now would be for the US to provide some kind of its own stockpile. I think that's probably what people are referring to in South Korea when they say they think their country should have nuclear weapons. But there is some talk that if they needed to, South Korea could develop nuclear weapons very quickly with the technology that it has.
Are these moves being forced by realistic recognitions, as you mentioned earlier? Another realistic recognition, which we have not quite touched on, is the changing geopolitical mood and the shifting alliances within Northeast Asia. So you've got Russia and Ukraine, and therefore Russia now more dependent on support, on help, actual tech help, weapons help from China indirectly, and North Korea more directly. North Korea looking, this is a chance for it to have friends at a time when it might have found it more difficult to find support for its many moves. So Russia stepping into to now take away any monitoring of the UN sanctions program, watching over North Korea's nuclear weapons program. With this changing situation, that is another reality change that needs to be taken into account, along with quantitative, qualitative improvements in North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
That's exactly right. So this program that North Korea has developed over the last 20 years has been very much facing international sanctions, with China sometimes cooperating more than other times. But China has by far been North Korea's most significant partner in terms of the help it's getting in terms of resisting international sanctions up until recently. For the last year, Russia has really stepped into that role. It was Russia that was responsible for dismantling the panel of experts that was monitoring North Korean compliance or international compliance with the existing sanctions against North Korea. And then, of course, there have been 2 summits in the last year between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. So this is looking like a second spoke in North Korea's arsenal of powerful allies that it can kind of, if not rely on, at least it can look to for some reassurance. It seems as if they are getting some technology assistance in return for cooperating with Russia, and in the future they might get some food or fuel assistance from Russia as well. So it's hard to tell if China sees this as a trilateral alliance at this point, or Russia moving in on its turf as far as influence with North Korea. It could go either way at this point, but it definitely shifts the calculus for North Korea in a way that it hasn't been able to in quite some time, almost back to a Cold War era setup where North Korea used to play China and Russia off against each other for aid and influence in the 70s and 80s quite effectively before the Soviet Union collapsed. So I think from North Korea's perspective, they would quite like to get back to that more comfortable scenario.
So, of course, China's Li Qiang, Premier Li Qiang, is in Russia to boost ties again. Now, when you say it could go either way, are you suggesting that China might be less than comfortable with North Korea, which is China's only formal ally, getting too cozy with Russia and moving away from a long-term ally, that's Beijing?
Well, China certainly has a lot to gain from Russia receiving help from North Korea and North Korea receiving help from Russia. It's not necessarily losing out in this scenario. I think it would depend on what sort of technology Russia would provide to North Korea in exchange for this help that it's getting in its war effort. If that help has something to do with further nuclear development, I think China has been more concerned with the North Korean possibility of a serious accident or radiation leak that's very close to its border. So I can see some scenarios in the future where that China might really want to have some influence and say in what sort of technology gets developed in the nuclear program. But China also benefits from Russia having a continuing the fight in Ukraine and keeping the West bogged down in that area. So China is at the moment, it seems to be content to let this situation play out.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Moretta Shaw, Korea Foundation Fellow and visiting scholar at the Korea Institute for National Unification. As the Obamas offer vigorous endorsement of Kamala Harris, Democrats are huddling at their convention in Chicago to consider what changes might be made in U.S. foreign policy should Ms. Harris succeed Joe Biden. Simon Marks with this report.
This convention is now engaged in a pivot away from the Biden era that will soon wrap up and towards the Harris era that Democrats hope is about to begin. But while there is plenty of sizzle on display in the convention arena ahead of Thursday night's balloon drop following Kamala Harris's big speech, Democrats are also feverishly engaged behind the scenes in a search for some steak. The quest is urgent because Kamala Harris has inherited a 92-page party platform that was written when everyone thought Joe Biden was going to be the party's presidential nominee. But she will, of course, want to lay out her own policy plans. The Center for American Progress was one organization on Tuesday convening a meeting where Democrats could discuss what the first 100 days of a Harris administration might look like at home and overseas. Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado is the assistant leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives.
Vice President Harris has articulated over the course of just the last 10 days a very specific, actionable plan that a Democratic Congress can take up to address the consequential challenges we face here in the United States. Just by way of example, with respect to some of the economic pains that folks are feeling, an effort to address lowering costs, to take on price gouging. She outlined a very ambitious and, I think, thoughtful and cogent plan around lowering the cost of housing, just by way of example, on Friday of last week. So I'm excited about the platform.
But there are many voices here furious about it, at least as far as its elements on the Middle East are concerned. Protesters trying to encircle this convention say Harris needs to be specific about how she will adjust US policy towards Israel and Gaza and go beyond simply saying that she will not be silent about civilian deaths. Within the security perimeter, there is less support for that view.
I think the United States has really taken the right position in moving this to a relatively, I hope, unified ceasefire that's going to have durability and be able to last longer. The first one only lasted for 4 days. We need something that can last longer than that. And the only way we can get that is if Hamas and Israel come to terms and reach an agreement.
Starring on Tuesday on the fringes of the Democratic Party convention, former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. She is urging Democrats to embrace the concept that voters are looking for a different kind of politics that forces politicians to lift their own sights and expectations.
Look, if there's any lesson I learned while in politics, it was that, ultimately the politics of any country is for that nation to decide and for that people to decide. But I certainly get asked a lot generally about politics at the moment, the global state of politics. And I do think if you look around the world, there is a call from voters to see that positivity from politicians, to try and reduce that sense of division.
But whether the Democratic Party, a political behemoth and also a massive fundraising machine, can entirely heed that advice is an open question as Kamala Harris comes to the fore. On Wednesday night, it's her running mate, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, who will be centre stage on stage, an opportunity for him to introduce himself to voters tuning in on America's television networks and also to those consuming excerpts of the speech online. He'll also be paving the way for Kamala Harris's big address on Thursday night. Simon Marks, CNA, at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
It's the lead on East Asia tonight, how farmers in Japan are keeping their cattle cool amid a heat wave. Zhongdari, a storm lashing the Korean peninsula, has weakened to a tropical depression. Authorities are warning of heavy rains until Thursday across parts of the country, including the Greater Seoul area and surrounding provinces such as Gangwon and South Chungcheong. Some areas could receive up to 100 millimeters of rain. The storm also unleashed flash floods in China's Fujian province. Separately, intense rain not related to Zhongdari flooded villages and caused landslides in China's northeastern Liaoning province. Officials say some 300 people were stranded, with communications in the affected area cut off. CCTV News says rescue teams from around the province have been flown in to assist. Japan remains in the throes of a heat wave, with temperatures up to 35 degrees Celsius expected across vast swathes of the country until at least Thursday. The country sweltered through its hottest July on record this year, and officials are predicting hotter than usual weather to persist until November. Businesses are taking new measures to adapt. In Tochigi Prefecture, where the mercury soared to up to 41 degrees Celsius last month, cattle breeder Tamura Farm has brought in more fans and mist sprays to keep their herd cool.
いられる気温の幅がすごく親より子牛の方が少ないので、気温帯がやはり朝元気でも夕方しんどそうにしてたりとか、もうすぐ変わってしまうので、そこは目を光らせて見る感じですね。
This farmer also places ice packs around the necks of her cattle, calling them mutukururi. It's a Japanese wordplay on how the cows moo in relief as they receive some respite from the heat. The farmer admits she had to spend extra dollars and time to keep her herd cool, something she has little choice with as temperatures rise across Japan.
来年が怖いんですけれども、暑くなったらこれ以上の対策をどうしようかなと、ちょっと先のことを本当に考えていかないと、暑さ対策もっと真剣に、考えていかないと、もう冷房施設を作るなり、そのぐらいの規模のことを考えていかないといけなくなってきているのかなとは思いますね。
A few months ago, we reported on a resort town in Japan that blocked out a popular view of Mount Fuji to curb unruly tourists. You can see why some would risk their lives for a photograph just like this one. Two Japanese icons in one frame, Mount Fuji towering over the ubiquitous Lawson convenience store. The town of Fujikawa, Gokicho made headlines back in May for installing a large screen to block the view after locals complained of tourists jaywalking while trying to take their photographs. The drastic move did reduce the number of pesky visitors, but in view of a typhoon last week, the town took down the screen and has decided not to put it back up, just to see what would happen. A town official warns they could put the screen back up again if tourists cause trouble once again. On Mount Fuji itself, new measures to curb over-tourism are bearing fruit, especially when it comes to the dangerous act of, quote, bullet climbing. That's when hikers walk through the night without a break to catch sunrise at the summit. The new measures taken up last month include an entrance fee of $14, restricting the period of entry, as well as capping the number of climbers at 4,000. Bullet climbing is not just dangerous, it also leads to the blocking of trails, hogging of bathrooms, as well as noise pollution at night. Following the new measures, one checkpoint reported a 90% decrease in late-night climbing compared to last year. Local business owners have praised the initiative, but some workers say more can still be done. They want to have the authority to stop bullet climbers instead of just discouraging them. And that's East Asia Tonight for this Wednesday. Don't forget headlines anytime at cna.asia. That's on Facebook, YouTube, and X.